Disc 5.
We then turned our attention to our fruit trees, which we had planted in a plot, ready for transplanting. The walnut, cherry, and chestnut trees we arranged in parallel rows, so as to form a shady avenue from Falconhurst to Family Bridge, and between them we laid down a tolerable road, that we might have no difficulty in reaching Tentholm, be the weather bad as it might. We planted the vines round the arched roots of our great mangrove, and the rest of the trees in suitable spots, some near Falconhurst, and others away over Jackal River, to adorn Tentholm. Tentholm had been the subject of serious thoughts to me for some time past, and I now turned all my attention thither. It was not my ambition to make it beautiful, but to form of it a safe place of refuge in a case of emergency. My first care, therefore, was to plant a thick, prickly hedge, capable of protecting us from any wild animal, and forming a tolerable obstacle to the attack of even savages, should they appear. Not satisfied with this, however, we fortified the bridge, and on a couple of hillocks mounted 2 guns which we brought from the wreck, and with whose angry mouths we might bark defiance at any enemy, man or beast. 6 weeks slipped away while we were thus busily occupied, 6 weeks of hard yet pleasant labor. We greeted each Sunday and its accompanying rest most gratefully, and on that day always especially thanked God for our continued health and safety. I soon saw that this hard work was developing in the boys remarkable strength, and this I encouraged by making them practice running, leaping, climbing, and swimming. I also saw, however, that it was having a less satisfactory effect upon their clothes, which, though a short time before remarkably neat, were now, in spite of mending and patching, most untidy and disreputable. I determined, therefore, to pay another visit to the wreck, to replenish our wardrobe, and to see how much longer the vessel was likely to hold together. 3 of the boys and I went off in the pinnace. The old ship seemed in much the same condition as when we had left her. A few more planks had gone, but that was all. "Come, boys," cried I, "not an article of the slightest value must be left on board. Rummage her out to the very bottom of her hold." They took me at my word. Sailors' chests, bales of cloth and linen, a couple of small guns, ball and shot, tables, benches, window shutters, bolts and locks, barrels of pitch, all were soon in a heap on the deck. We loaded the pinnace and went on shore. We soon returned with our tub-boat in tow, and after a few more trips, nothing was left on board. "One more trip," said I to my wife before we started again, "and there will be the end of the brave ship which carried us from Switzerland. I have left 2 barrels of gunpowder on board, and mean to blow her up." Before we lighted the fuse, I discovered a large copper cauldron which I thought I might save. I made fast to it a couple of empty casks, that when the ship went up, it might float. The barrels were placed, the train lighted, and we returned on shore. The supper was laid outside the tent, at a spot from whence we might obtain a good view of the wreck. Darkness came on. Suddenly, a vivid pillar of fire rose from the black waters. A sullen roar boomed across the sea, and we knew that our good old ship was no more. We had planned the destruction of the vessel. We knew that it was for the best. And yet, that night we went to bed with a feeling of sadness in our hearts, as though we had lost a dear old friend. Next morning, all our sadness was dispelled, and it was with pleasure that we saw the shore lined with a rich store of planks and beams, the remnants of the wreck. I soon found, too, the copper cauldron which was successfully floated by the casks. This I got on shore, and hauling it up among the rocks, stored under it the powder casks we had landed the day before. Collecting all these valuables gave us some little trouble, and while we were thus engaged, my wife brought us good news. She had discovered that 2 ducks and a goose had each reared a large family among the reeds by the river, and they presently appeared waddling past us, apparently vastly well pleased with their performance. We greeted them joyfully. "Hurrah!" cried Ernest. "We'll be able to afford duck and green peas some day soon, and imagine we're once more civilized mortals." The sight of these birds reminded me of our family at Falconhurst, and I announced my intention of paying them a visit. Everyone was delighted, and everyone would come with me. As we approached Falconhurst, I noticed that several young trees in our avenue were considerably bent by the wind, and this resolved me to make an expedition next day to cut bamboos for their support. As Fritz was the only one besides myself who had visited Cape Disappointment and the surrounding country, my wife and the younger boys begged hard to be allowed to accompany me. I consented, and next morning we started, bringing with us the cart, drawn by the cow and ass, and laden with everything necessary for an expedition of several days: a tent, provisions, a large supply of ammunition, and all sorts of implements and utensils, for I intended to make a great collection of fruits and the produce of different trees. It was a lovely morning, and passing gaily through the plantations of potatoes, manioc, and cassavas, we came to the nests of the sociable grosbeak, the sight of which charmed the children immensely. We reached the wax trees, and there I called a halt, for I wished to gather a sack or 2 of the berries that we might renew our stock of candles. The berries were soon plucked, and I stored them away amongst the bushes, marking the spot that we might find them on our return. "Now for the caoutchouc tree," said I. "Now for waterproof boots and leggings to keep your feet dry, Ernest." To the caoutchouc tree we directed our steps, and were soon busily engaged in stabbing the bark and placing vessels beneath to catch the sap. We again moved forward, and crossing the palm-wood, entered upon a delightful plain, bounded on one side by an extensive field of waving sugar-cane, on the other by a thicket of bamboos and lovely palms, while in front stretched the shining sea, calm and noiseless. "How beautiful!" exclaimed Jack. "Let us pitch our tent here and stay here always instead of living at Falconhurst. It would be jolly." "Very likely," replied I, "and so would be the attacks of wild beasts. Imagine a great tiger lying in wait in the thicket yonder and pouncing out on us at night. No, no, thank you. I much prefer our nest in the tree, or our impregnable position at Tentholm. We must make this our headquarters for the present, however, for though perhaps dangerous, it is the most convenient spot we shall find. Call a halt and pitch the tent." Our beasts were quickly unyoked, the tent arranged, a large fire lit, supper prepared, and we dispersed in various directions, some to cut bamboos and some to collect sugar-cane. We then returned, and as supper was still not quite ready and the boys were hungry, they decided to obtain some coconuts. This time, however, no assistance was to be had from either monkeys or land crabs, and they gazed up with longing eyes at the fruit above them. "We can climb," said Fritz. "Up with you, boys." Jack and he each rushed at one of the smooth, slippery trunks. Right vigorously they struggled upwards, but to no purpose. Before they had accomplished 1/4 of the distance, they found themselves slipping rapidly to the ground. "Here, you young athletes," cried I. "I foresaw this difficulty and have provided for it." So saying, I held up buskins of shark skin, which I had previously prepared, and which I now bound onto their legs. Thus equipped, they again attempted the ascent, and with a loop of rope passed round their body and the trunk of the tree, quickly reached the summit. My wife joined me, and together we watched the boys as they ascended tree after tree, throwing down the best fruit from each. They then returned and jestingly begged Ernest to produce the result of his labor. The professor had been lying on the grass gazing at the palms, but on this sarcastic remark he sprang to his feet. "Willingly," he exclaimed, and seizing a pair of buskins, he quickly donned them. "Give me a coconut shell," said he. I gave him one, and he put it in his pocket. He ran to a tree and, with an agility which surprised us all, quickly reached the top. No sooner had he done so than Fritz and Jack burst into a roar of laughter. He had swarmed a tree which bore no nuts. Ernest apparently heard them, for, as it seemed in a fit of anger, he drew his knife and severed the leafy crest, which fell to the ground. I glanced up at him, surprised at such a display of temper. But a bright smile greeted me, and in a merry tone he shouted, "Jack, pick that palm cabbage up and take it to father. That is only half my contribution, and it is worth all your nuts put together." He spoke truly. The cabbage palm is rare, and the tuft of leaves at its summit is greatly prized by the South Americans for its great delicacy and highly nutritive qualities. "Bravo!" I cried. "You have retrieved your character. Come down and receive the thanks of the company. What are you waiting up there for?" "I am coming presently," he replied, "with the second half of my contribution. I hope it will be as fully appreciated as the first." In a short time he slipped down the tree, and advancing to his mother, presented her with the nutshell he had taken up with him. "Here," he said, "is a wine which the greatest connoisseur would prize. Taste it, mother." The shell was filled with a clear, rosy liquor, bright and sparkling. My wife tasted it. "Excellent! Excellent!" she exclaimed. "Your very good health, my dear boy." We drank the rosy wine in turn, and Ernest received hearty thanks from all. It was getting late, and while we were enjoying our supper before our tent, our donkey, who had been quietly browsing near us, suddenly set up a loud bray, and without the least apparent cause, pricked up his ears, threw up his heels, and galloped off into the thicket of bamboos. We followed for a short distance, and I sent the dogs in chase, but they returned without our friend, and as it was late, we were obliged to abandon the chase. I was annoyed by this incident, and even alarmed, for not only had we lost the ass, but I knew not what had occasioned his sudden flight. I knew not whether he was aware by instinct of the approach of some fierce wild beast. I said nothing of this to my family, but making up an unusually large fire, I bade them sleep with their weapons by their sides, and we all lay down. A bright morning awoke us early, and I rose and looked out, thinking that perhaps our poor donkey might have been attracted by the light of the fires and have returned. Alas, not a sign of him was to be seen. As we could not afford to lose so valuable a beast, I determined to leave no attempt untried to regain him. We hurriedly breakfasted, and as I required the dogs to assist me in the search, I left my elder sons to protect their mother and bade Jack get ready for a day's march. This arrangement delighted him, and we quickly set out. For an hour or more we trudged onwards, directed by the print of the ass's hoofs. Sometimes we lost the track for a while, and then again discovered it as we reached softer soil. Finally this guide failed us altogether, for the donkey seemed to have joined in with a herd of some larger animals, with whose hoofprints his had mingled. I now almost turned back in despair, but Jack urged me to continue the search. "For," said he, If we once get upon a hill, we shall see such a large herd as this must be at almost any distance. Do let us go on, father." I consented, and we again pushed forwards, through bushes and over torrents, sometimes cutting our way with an axe, and sometimes plunging knee-deep through a swamp. We at length reached the border of a wide plain, and on it, in the distance, I could see a herd of animals browsing on the rich grass. It struck me that it might be the very herd to which our good donkey had joined himself, and wishing to ascertain whether this was so, I resolved to make a detour through a bamboo marsh, and get as near as possible to the animals without disturbing them. The bamboos were huge, many of them over 30 feet in height, and as we made our way through them, I remembered an account of the giant cane of South America, which is greatly prized by the Indians on account of its extreme usefulness. The reeds themselves make masts for their canoes, while each joint will form a cask or box. I was delighted, for I had little doubt that the bamboos we were among were of the same species. I explained this to Jack, and as we discussed the possibility of cutting one down and carrying a portion of it home, we reached the border of the marsh and emerged upon the plain. There we suddenly found ourselves face to face with the herd which we sought, a herd of buffaloes. They looked up and stared at us inquisitively, but without moving. Jack would have fired, but I checked him. "Back to the thicket," I said, "and keep back the dogs." We began to retreat, but before we were again under cover, the dogs joined us, and in spite of our shouts and efforts to restrain them, they dashed forwards and seized a buffalo calf. This was a signal to the whole herd to attack us. They bellowed loudly, pawed the ground, and tore it up with their horns, and then dashed madly towards us. We had not time to step behind a rock before the leader was upon us. So close was he that my gun was useless. I drew a pistol and fired. He fell dead at my feet. His fall checked the advance of the rest. They halted, snuffed the air, turned tail, and galloped off across the plain. They were gone, but the dogs still held gallantly to the calf. They dragged and tussled with him, but with their utmost efforts could not bring him to the ground. How to assist them without shooting the poor beast I knew not, and this I was unwilling to do, for I hoped that if we could but capture him alive, we might in time manage to tame him and use him as a beast of burden. Jack's clever little head, however, suddenly devised a plan for their aid, and with his usual promptitude he at once put it into execution. He unwound the lasso which was coiled round his body, and, as the young bull flung up his heels, he cast it and caught him by his hind legs. The noose drew tight, and in a twinkling the beast was upon the ground. We fastened the other end of the cord round a stout bamboo, called off the dogs, and the animal was at our mercy. "Now we have got him," said Jack, as he looked at the poor beast lying panting on the ground. "What are we to do with him?" "I will show you," said I. "Help me to fasten his forelegs together, and you shall see the next operation." The bull thus secured could not move, and while Jack held his head, I drew my knife and pierced the cartilage of his nose, and when the blood flowed less freely, passed a stout cord through the hole. I felt some repugnance at thus paining the animal, but it was a case of necessity, and I could not hesitate. We united the ends of the cord, freed the animal, set him upon its legs, and subdued and overawed, he followed us without resistance. I now turned my attention to the dead buffalo, but as I could not then skin it, I contented myself with cutting off the most delicate parts, its tongue and a couple of steaks, and packing them in salt in my wallet, abandoned the rest to the dogs. They fell upon it greedily, and we retired under the shade to enjoy a meal after our hard work. The dogs, however, were not to have undisputed possession of the carcass. Vultures, crows, and other birds of prey, with that marvelous instinct which always leads them to a dead body, quickly filled the air, and with discordant cries swooped down upon the buffalo. An amusing contest ensued. The dogs again and again drove off the intruders, and they, as often, returned reinforced by others who swarmed to the spot. Jack, with his usual impetuosity, wished to send a shot in amongst the robber band, but I prevented him, for I knew that the bird or two he might kill would be of no use to us, while his shot would not drive away the rest, even had we wished it. Both we and the dogs were at length satisfied, and as it was getting late, I determined to give up for the present the search for the ass, and to return to our camp. We again made our way through the bamboos, but before we left the thicket, I cut down one of the smallest of the reeds, the largest of whose joints would form capital little barrels, while those near the tapering top would serve as molds for our next batch of candles. The buffalo, with a dog on either side and the rope through his nose, was following us passively, and we presently induced him to submit to a package of our goods laid upon his back. We pushed rapidly forward, Jack eager to display our latest acquisition. As we repassed the rocky head of a stream we had crossed in the morning, Juno dashed ahead and was about to rush into a cleft between the rocks when the appearance of a large jackal suddenly checked her further progress. Both dogs instantly flew at the animal, and though she fought desperately, quickly overpowered and throttled her. From the way the beast had shown fight, I concluded that her young must be close by, probably within the very cleft Juno was about to enter. Directly Jack heard this, he wished to creep in and bring out the young jackals. I hesitated to allow him to do so, for I thought it possible that the male jackal might be still lying in wait within the cave. We peered into the darkness, and after a while Jack declared he could discern the little yellow jackals, and that he was quite sure the old one was not there. He then crept in, followed closely by the dogs, and presently emerged bearing in his arms a handsome cub of a beautiful golden yellow and about the size of a small cat. He was the only one of the brood he had managed to save, for Turk and Juno, without pity for their youth or beauty, had worried all the rest. I did not much regret this, however, for I firmly believed that had he saved them, Jack would have insisted upon bringing up the whole litter. As it was, I considered that one jackal was, with our young bull, quite sufficient an addition to our livestock. During the halt we had made, I had fastened the buffalo to a small tree, and as I now was again about to move on, I recognized it as the dwarf palm, whose long, sharp leaves form an excellent barrier if it is planted as a hedge. I determined to return and get some young plants to strengthen our hedge at Tentholm. It was late before we reached our camp, where we found our family anxiously awaiting our return. The sight of the new animals delighted the children immensely, and in their opinion amply compensated for the loss of our poor donkey. Jack had to answer a host of questions concerning their capture, and to give a minute account of the affray with the buffaloes. This he did, with graphic power certainly, but with so much boasting and self-glorification that I was obliged to check him and give a plain and unvarnished account of the affair. Supper time arrived, and as we sat at that meal, for which Jack and I were heartily thankful, my wife and her party proceeded to give an account of their day's work. Ernest had discovered a sago palm, and had after much labor contrived to fell it. Franz and his mother had collected dry wood, of which a huge heap now stood before the tent, sufficient to keep up a fire all the rest of the time we should stay on the spot. Fritz had gone off shooting, and had secured a good bag. While they had been thus variously employed, a troop of apes had visited the tent, and when they returned, they found the place ransacked and turned upside down. The provisions were eaten and gnawed, the potatoes thrown about, the milk drunk and spilt. Every box had been peeped into, every pot and pan had been divested of its lid. The palisade round the hut had been partly destroyed. Nothing had been left untouched. Industriously had the boys worked to repair the damage, and when we returned not a sign was to be seen of the disorder. No one would have guessed what had occurred from the delicious supper we were eating. After matters had been again arranged, Fritz had gone down to the shore and, amongst the rocks at Cape Disappointment, had discovered a young eaglet, which Ernest declared to be a Malabar or Indian eagle. He was much pleased with his discovery, and I recommended him to bring the bird up and try to train it to hunt as a falcon. "Look here, though, boys," said I. "You are now collecting a good many pets, and I am not going to have your mother troubled with the care of them all. Each must look after his own, and if I find one neglected, whether beast or bird, I set it at liberty. Mark that and remember it." My wife looked greatly relieved at this announcement, and the boys promised to obey my directions. Before we retired for the night, I prepared the buffalo meat I had brought. I lit a large fire of green wood, and in the smoke of this thoroughly dried both the tongue and steaks. We then properly secured all the animals. Jack took his little pet in his arms, and we lay down and were soon fast asleep. At daybreak we were on foot, and began to prepare for a return to Falconhurst. "You are not going to despise my sago, I hope," said Ernest. "You have no idea what a trouble it was to cut it down, and I have been thinking, too, that if we could but split the tree, we might make a couple of long, useful troughs, which might, I think, be made to carry water from Jackal River to Tentholm. Is my plan worth consideration?" "Indeed it is," I replied, "and at all events we must not abandon such a valuable prize as a sago palm. I would put off our departure for a day rather than leave it behind." We went to the palm, and with the tools we had with us, attempted to split the trunk. We first sawed off the upper end, and then with an axe and saw managed to insert a wedge. This accomplished, our task was less difficult, for with a heavy mallet we forced the wedge in further and further, until at length the trunk was split in twain. From one half of the trunk we then removed the pith, disengaging it with difficulty from the tough wood fibers. At each end, however, I left a portion of the pith untouched, thus forming a trough in which to work the sago. "Now, boys," said I, when we had removed the pith from the other half of the trunk, "off with your coats and turn up your shirt sleeves. I am going to teach you to knead." They were all delighted, and even little Franz begged to be allowed to help. Ernest brought a couple of pitchers of water, and throwing it in amongst the pith, we set to work right heartily. As the dough was formed and properly kneaded, I handed it to my wife, who spread it out on a cloth in the sun to dry. This new occupation kept us busy until the evening, and when it was at length completed, we loaded the cart with the sago, a store of coconuts, and our other possessions, that we might be ready to start early on the following morning. As the sun rose above the horizon, we packed up our tent and set forth, a goodly caravan. I thought it unfair to the cow to make her drag such a load as we now had alone, and determined if possible to make the young buffalo take the place of our lost donkey. After some persuasion, he consented, and soon put his strength to the work and brought the cart along famously. As we had the trough slung under the cart, we had to choose the clearest possible route, avoiding anything like a thicket. We therefore could not pass directly by the candleberry and caoutchouc trees, and I sent Ernest and Jack aside to visit the store we had made on our outward journey. They had not long been gone when I was alarmed by a most terrible noise, accompanied by the furious barking of the dog and shouts from Jack and Ernest. Thinking that the boys had been attacked by some wild beast, I ran to their assistance. A most ludicrous scene awaited me when I reached the spot. They were dancing and shouting round and round a grassy glade, and I, as nearly as possible, followed their example, for in the center, surrounded by a promising litter, lay our old sow, whose squeals, previously so alarming, were now subsiding into comfortable grunts of recognition. I did not join my boys in their triumphal dance, but I was nevertheless very much pleased at the sight of the flourishing family, and immediately returned to the cart to obtain biscuits and potatoes for the benefit of the happy mother. Jack and Ernest, meanwhile, pushed further on, and brought back the sack of candleberries and the caoutchouc, and as we could not then take the sow with us, we left her alone with her family, and proceeded to Falconhurst. The animals were delighted to see us back again, and received us with manifestations of joy, but looked askance at the new pets. The eagle especially came in for shy glances, and promised to be no favorite. Fritz, however, determined that his pet should at present do no harm, secured him by the leg to a root of the fig tree, and uncovered his eyes. In a moment the aspect of the bird was changed. With his sight returned all his savage instincts. He flapped his wings, raised his head, darted to the full length of his chain, and before anyone could prevent him, seized the unfortunate parrot which stood near and tore it to pieces. Fritz's anger rose at the sight, and he was about to put an end to the savage bird. "Stop," said Ernest. "Don't kill the poor creature. He is but following his natural instincts. Give him to me, and I will tame him." Fritz hesitated. No, he said. "I don't want really to kill the bird, but I can't give him up. Tell me how to tame him, and you shall have Master Nips." "Very well," replied Ernest. "I will tell you my plan, and if it succeeds, I will accept Nips as a mark of your gratitude. Take a pipe and tobacco, and send the smoke all round his head, so that he must inhale it. By degrees he will become stupefied, and his savage nature from that moment subdued." Fritz was rather inclined to ridicule the plan, but knowing that Ernest generally had a good reason for anything of the sort that he proposed, he consented to make the attempt. He soon seated himself beneath the bird, who still struggled furiously, and puffed cloud after cloud upwards, and as each cloud circled round the eagle's head, he became quieter and quieter, until he sat quite still, gazing stupidly at the young smoker. "Capital!" cried Fritz as he hooded the bird. "Capital, Ernest! Nips is yours." Chapter 8. Next morning the boys and I started with the cart, laden with our bundles of bamboos, to attend to the avenue of fruit trees. The buffalo we left behind, for his services were not needed, and I wished the wound in his nostrils to become completely cicatrized before I again put him to work. We were not a moment too soon. Many of the young trees which before threatened to fall had now fulfilled their promise, and were lying prostrate on the ground. Others were bent. Some few only remained erect. We raised the trees, and digging deeply at their roots, drove in stout bamboo props, to which we lashed them firmly with strong, broad fibers. "Papa," said Franz, as we were thus engaged, and he handed me the fibers as I required them, "are these wild or tame trees?" "Oh, these are wild trees, most ferocious trees," laughed Jack, "and we are tying them up lest they should run away, and in a little while we will untie them, and they will trot about after us and give us fruit wherever we go. Oh, we will tame them. They shall have a ring through their noses like the buffalo." "That's not true," replied Franz gravely. "But there are wild and tame trees. The wild ones grow out in the woods, like the crab apples, and the tame ones in the garden, like the pears and peaches at home. Which are these, Papa?" "They are not wild," I replied, "but grafted or cultivated, or, as you call them, tame trees." "Do you think all these trees will grow?" asked Fritz, as we crossed Jackal River and entered our plantation at Tantholm. "Here are lemons, pomegranates, pistachio nuts, and mulberries." We talked and worked until every tree that required the treatment was provided with a stout bamboo prop, and then, with appetites which a gourmand might well have envied, we returned to Falconhurst. I think my good wife was almost alarmed at the way we fell upon the corned beef and palm cabbage she set before us. But at length these good things produced the desired effect, and one after another declared themselves satisfied. As we sat reclining after our labor and digesting our dinner, we discussed the various projects we had in contemplation. "I wish," said my wife, "that you would invent some other plan for climbing to the nest above us. I think that the nest itself is perfect. I really wish for nothing better. But I should like to be able to get to it without scaling that dreadful ladder every time. Could you not make a flight of steps to reach it?" I carefully thought over the project and turned over every plan for its accomplishment. "It would be impossible, I am afraid," said I, "to make stairs outside. But within the trunk it might be done. More than once have I thought that this trunk might be hollow, or partly so, and if such be the case, our task would be comparatively easy. Did you not tell me the other day that you noticed bees coming from a hole in the tree?" "Oh, yes," said little Franz, "and I went to look at them, and one flew right against my face and stung me, and I almost cried, but I didn't." "Brave little boy," said I. "Well now, if the trunk be sufficiently hollow to contain a swarm of bees, it may be, for all we can tell, hollow the greater part of its length. For like the willow in our own country, it might draw all its nourishment through the bark, and in spite of its real unsoundness, retain a flourishing appearance." Master Jack, practical as usual, instantly sprang to his feet to put my conjecture to the proof. The rest followed his example, and they were all soon climbing about like squirrels, peeping into the hole, and tapping the wood to discover by sound how far down the cavity extended. They forgot in their eagerness who were the tenants of this interesting trunk. They were soon reminded of it, however, for the bees, disturbed by this unusual noise, with an angry buzz burst out and in an instant attacked the causers of the annoyance. They swarmed round them, stung them on the hands, face, and neck, settled in their hair, and pursued them as they ran to me for assistance. It was with difficulty that we got rid of the angry insects and were able to attend to the boys. Jack, who had been the first to reach the hole, had fared the worst, and was soon a most pitiable sight. His face swelled to an extraordinary degree, and it was only by the constant application of cold earth that the pain was alleviated. They were all eager to commence an organized attack upon the bees at once, but for an hour or more, by reason of their pain, they were unable to render me much assistance. In the meanwhile, I made my arrangements. I first took a large calabash gourd, for I intended to make a beehive, that when we had driven the insects from their present abode, we might not lose them entirely. The lower half of the gourd I flattened. I then cut an arched opening in the front for a doorway, made a straw roof as a protection from the rain and heat, and the little house was complete. Nothing more, however, could then be done, for the irritated bees were still angrily buzzing round the tree. I waited till dark, and then, when all the bees had again returned to their trunk, with Fritz's assistance I carefully stopped up every hole in the tree with wet clay, that the bees might not issue forth next morning before we could begin operations. Very early were we up and at work. I first took a hollow cane and inserted one end through the clay into the tree. Down this tube, with pipe and tobacco, I smoked most furiously. The humming and buzzing that went on within was tremendous. The bees evidently could not understand what was going to happen. I finished my first pipeful, and putting my thumb over the end of the cane, I gave the pipe to Fritz to refill. He did so, and I again smoked. The buzzing was now becoming less noisy, and was subsiding into a mere murmur. By the time I had finished this second pipe, all was still. The bees were stupefied. "Now then, Fritz," said I, "quick with a hammer and chisel, and stand here beside me." He was up in a moment, and together we cut a small door by the side of the hole. This door, however, we did not take out, but we left it attached by one corner, that it might be removed at a moment's notice. Then, giving the bees a final dose of tobacco smoke, we opened it. Carefully but rapidly we removed the insects as they clung in clusters to the sides of the tree, and placed them in the hive prepared for their reception. As rapidly I then took every atom of wax and honey from their storehouse and put it in a cask I had made ready for the purpose. The bees were now safely removed from the trunk, but I could not tell whether, when they revived from their temporary stupor, they might not refuse to occupy the house with which I had presented them, and insist on returning to their old quarters. To prevent the possibility of this occurrence, I took a quantity of tobacco, and placing it upon a board nailed horizontally within the trunk, I lighted it and allowed it to burn slowly, that the fumes might fill the cavity. It was well I did so, for as the bees returned to consciousness, they left their pretty hive and buzzed away to the trunk of the tree. They seemed astonished at finding this uninhabitable, and an immense deal of noisy humming ensued. Round and round they flew, backwards and forwards between the gourd and tree, now settling here and now there, until at length, after due consideration, they took possession of the hive and abandoned their former habitation to us, the invaders of their territory. By the evening they were quite quiet, and we ventured to open the cask in which we had stored our plunder. We first separated the honey from the honeycomb and poured it off into jars and pots. The rest we then took and threw into a vessel of water placed over a slow fire. It soon boiled, and the entire mass became fluid. This we placed in a clean canvas bag and subjected to a heavy pressure. The honey was thus soon forced out, and we stored it in a cask, and though not perhaps quite equal to the former batch in quality, it was yet capital. The wax that remained in the bag I also carefully stored, for I knew it would be of great use to me in the manufacture of candles. Then, after a hard day's work, we turned in. The internal architecture of the tree had now to be attended to, and early the following morning we prepared for the laborious task. A door had first to be made, so at the base of the trunk we cut away the bark and formed an opening just the size of the door we had brought from the captain's cabin, and which, hinges and all, was ready to be hung. The clearing of the rotten wood from the center of the trunk occupied us some time, but at length we had the satisfaction of seeing it entirely accomplished, and as we stood below we could look up the trunk, which was like a great smooth funnel, and see the sky above. It was now ready for the staircase, and first we erected in the center a stout sapling to form an axis round which to build the spiral stairs. In this we cut notches to receive the steps, and corresponding notches in the tree itself to support the outer ends. The steps themselves we formed carefully and neatly of planks from the wreck, and clenched them firmly in their places with stout nails. Upwards and upwards we built, cutting windows in the trunk as we required to admit light and air, until we were flush with the top of the center pole. On this pole, we erected another to reach the top of the tree, and securing it firmly, built in the same way round it until we at length reached the level of the floor of the nest above. To make the ascent of the stairs perfectly easy, we ran a handrail on either side, one round the center pillar and the other following the curve of the trunk. This task occupied us a whole month, and by the end of that period, so accustomed had we become to having a definite piece of work before us, that we began to consider what other great alteration we should undertake. We were, however, of course, not neglecting the details of our colonial establishment. There were all the animals to be attended to. The goats and sheep had both presented us with additions to our flock, and these frisky youngsters had to be seen after. To prevent them straying to any great distance, for we had no wish to lose them, we tied round their necks little bells which we had found on board the wreck, and which would assist us to track them. Juno, too, had a fine litter of puppies, but in spite of the entreaties of the children, I could not consent to keep more than 2, and the rest disappeared in that mysterious way in which puppies and kittens are wont to leave the earth. To console his mother, as he said, but also, I suspect, to save himself considerable trouble, Jack placed his little jackal beside the remaining puppies, and to his joy found it readily adopted. The other pets were also flourishing, and were being usefully trained. The buffalo, after giving us much trouble, had now become perfectly domesticated, and was a very useful beast of burden, besides being a capital steed for the boys. They guided him by a bar thrust through the hole in his nose, which was now perfectly healed, and this served the purpose just as a bit in the mouth of a horse. I began his education by securing round him a broad girth of buffalo hide and fastening to it various articles, to accustom him to carrying a burden. By degrees he permitted this to be done without making the slightest resistance, and soon carried the panniers, before borne by the ass, readily and willingly. I then made Master Nips sit upon his back and hold the reins I had prepared for him, that the animal might become accustomed to the feeling of a rider, and finally allowed Fritz himself to mount. The education of the eagle was not neglected. Fritz every day shot small birds for his food, and these he placed sometimes between the wide-spreading horns of the buffalo or goat, and sometimes upon the back of the great bustard, that he might become accustomed to pounce upon living prey. These lessons had their due effect, and the bird, having been taught to obey the voice and whistle of his master, was soon allowed to bring down small birds upon the wing, when he stooped and struck his quarry in most sportsmanlike manner. We kept him well away from the poultry yard, lest his natural instincts should show themselves, and he should put an untimely end to some of our feathered pets. Neither was Master Nips allowed to remain idle, for Ernest, now that he was in his possession, wished to train him to be of some use. With Jack's help, he made a little basket of rushes, which he so arranged with straps that it might be easily fitted onto the monkey's back. Thus equipped, he was taught to mount coconut palms and other lofty trees, and to bring down their fruit in the hamper. Jack was not so successful in his educational attempts. Fangs, as he had christened his jackal, used his fangs indeed, but only on his own account. Nothing could persuade him that the animals he caught were not at once to be devoured. Consequently, poor Jack was never able to save from his jaws anything but the tattered skin of his prey. Not disheartened, however, he determined that Fangs could be trained, and that he would train him. These and such like employments afforded us the rest and recreation we required while engaged in the laborious task of staircase building. Among my minor occupations, I applied myself to the improvement of our candles. Though the former batch had greatly delighted us at first, yet we were soon obliged to acknowledge that the light they gave was imperfect, and their appearance was unsightly. My wife, too, begged me to find some substitute for the threads of our cotton neckties, which I had previously used as wicks. To give the proper shape and smoothness to the candles, I determined to use the bamboo molds I had prepared. My first idea was to pour the wax in at the end of the mold, and then, when the candles were cooled, to slip them out. But I was soon convinced that this plan would not succeed. I therefore determined to divide the molds lengthways, and then, having greased them well, we might pour the melted wax into the two halves bound tightly together, and so be able to take out the candles when cool without injuring them. The wicks were my next difficulty, and as my wife positively refused to allow us to devote our ties and handkerchiefs for the purpose, I took a piece of inflammable wood from a tree, a native of the Antilles, which I thought would serve our purpose. This I cut into long slips and fixed in the centers of the molds. My wife, too, prepared some wicks from the fibers of the karata tree, which she declared would beat mine completely out of the field. We put them to the proof. On a large fire we placed a pot, in which we prepared our wax mixture, half beeswax and half wax from the candleberries. The molds, carefully prepared, half with karata fiber and half with wooden splint wicks, stood on their ends in a tub of cold water, ready to receive the wax. They were filled, the wax cooled, the candles taken out and subjected to the criticism of all hands. When night drew on, they were formally tested. The decision was unanimous. Neither gave such a good light as those with the cotton wicks, but even my wife declared that the light from mine was far preferable to that emitted by hers, for the former, though rather flaring, burned brilliantly, while the latter gave out such a feeble and flickering flame that it was almost useless. I then turned shoemaker, for I had promised myself a pair of waterproof boots, and now determined to make them. Taking a pair of socks, I filled them with sand, and then coated them over with a thin layer of clay to form a convenient mold. This was soon hardened in the sun and was ready for use. Layer after layer of caoutchouc I brushed over it, allowing each layer to dry before the next was put on, until at length I considered that the shoes were of sufficient thickness. I dried them, broke out the clay, secured with nails a strip of buffalo hide to the soles, brushed that over with caoutchouc, and I had a pair of comfortable, durable, respectable-looking, waterproof boots. I was delighted. Orders poured in from all sides, and soon everyone in the family was likewise provided for. One objection to Falconhurst was the absence of any spring close by, so that the boys were obliged to bring water daily from the stream, and this involving no little trouble, it was proposed that we should carry the water by pipes from the stream to our present residence. A dam had to be thrown across the river some way upstream, that the water might be raised to a sufficient height to run to Falconhurst. From the reservoir thus made, we led the water down by pipes into the turtle's shell, which we placed near our dwelling, and from which the superfluous water flowed off through the hole made in it by Fritz's harpoon. This was an immense convenience, and we formally inaugurated the trough by washing therein a whole sack of potatoes. Thus, day after day brought its own work, and day after day saw that work completed. We had no time to be idle, or to lament our separation from our fellow creatures. One morning, as we were completing our spiral staircase and giving it such finish as we were capable of, we were suddenly alarmed by hearing a most terrific noise, the roaring or bellowing of a wild beast. So strange a sound was it that I could not imagine by what animal it was uttered. Jack thought it perhaps a lion. Fritz hazarded a gorilla, while Ernest gave it as his opinion, and I thought it possible that he was right, that it was a hyena. "Whatever it is," said I, "we must prepare to receive it. Up with you all to the nest while I secure the door." Then, arming the dogs with their collars, I sent them out to protect the animals below, closed the door, and joined my family. Every gun was loaded. Every eye was upon the watch. The sound drew nearer, and then all was still. Nothing was to be seen. I determined to descend and reconnoiter, and Fritz and I carefully crept down. With our guns at full cock, we glided amongst the trees. Noiselessly and quickly we pushed on further and further. Suddenly, close by, we heard the terrific sound again. Fritz raised his gun, but almost as quickly again dropped it and burst into a hearty fit of laughter. There was no mistaking those dulcet tones. Hee-haw! 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 Resounded through the forest, and our ass, braying his approach right merrily, appeared in sight. To our surprise, however, our friend was not alone. Behind him trotted another animal, an ass, no doubt, but slim and graceful as a horse. We watched their movements anxiously. "Fritz," I whispered, "that is an onager. Creep back to Falconhurst and bring me a piece of cord. Quietly now." While he was gone, I cut a bamboo and split it halfway down to form a pair of pincers, which I knew would be of use to me should I get near the animal. Fritz soon returned with the cord, and I was glad to observe also brought some oats and salt. We made one end of the cord fast to a tree, and at the other end made a running noose. Silently we watched the animals as they approached, quietly browsing. Fritz then rose, holding in one hand the noose, and in the other some oats and salt. The ass, seeing his favorite food thus held out, advanced to take it. Fritz allowed him to do so, and he was soon munching contentedly. The stranger, on seeing Fritz, started back, but finding her companion show no signs of alarm, was reassured, and soon approached, sniffing, and was about to take some of the tempting food. In a moment the noose left Fritz's adroit hand and fell round her neck. With a single bound she sprang backwards the full length of the cord, the noose drew tight, and she fell to the earth, half strangled. I at once ran up, loosened the rope, and replaced it by a halter, and placing the pincers upon her nose, secured her by 2 cords fastened between 2 trees, and then left her to recover herself. Everyone hastened up to examine the beautiful animal as she rose from the ground, and cast fiery glances around. She lashed out with her heels on every side, and giving vent to angry snorts, struggled violently to get free. All her endeavors were vain. The cords were stout, and after a while she quieted down and stood exhausted and quivering. I then approached. She suffered me to lead her to the roots of our tree, which for the present formed our stables, and there I tied her up close to the donkey, who was likewise prevented from playing truant. Next morning I found the onager, after her night's rest, as wild as ever, and as I looked at the handsome creature, I almost despaired of ever taming her proud spirit. Every expedient was tried, and at length, when the animal was subdued by hunger, I thought I might venture to mount her, and having given her the strongest curb and shackled her feet, I attempted to do so. She was as unruly as ever, and as a last expedient I resolved to adopt a plan which, though cruel, was, I knew, attended with wonderful success by the American Indians, by whom it is practiced. Watching a favorable opportunity, I sprang upon the onager's back, and seizing her long ear in my teeth, in spite of her kicking and plunging, bit it through. The result was marvelous. The animal ceased plunging and, quivering violently, stood stock still. From that moment we were her masters. The children mounted her one after the other, and she carried them obediently and quietly. Proud indeed did I feel as I watched this animal, which naturalists and travelers have declared to be beyond the power of man to tame, guided hither and thither by my youngest son. Additions to our poultry yard reminded me of the necessity of providing some substantial shelter for our animals before the rainy season came on. 3 broods of chickens had been successfully hatched, and the little creatures, 40 in all, were my wife's pride and delight. We began by making a roof over the vaulted roots of our tree, forming the framework of bamboo canes, which we laid close together and bound tightly down. Others we fixed below as supports. The interstices were filled up with clay and moss, and coating the whole over with a mixture of tar and lime water, we obtained a firm balcony and a capital roof impervious to the severest fall of rain. I ran a light rail round the balcony to give it a more ornamental appearance, and below divided the building into several compartments: stables, poultry yard, hay and provision lofts, dairy, kitchen, larder, and dining hall were united under one roof. Our winter quarters were now completed, and we had but to store them with food. Day after day we worked, bringing in provisions of every description. As we were one evening returning from gathering potatoes, it struck me that we should take in a store of acorns, and sending the 2 younger boys home with their mother in the cart, I took a large canvas bag, and with Fritz and Ernest, the former mounted on his onager, and the latter carrying his little favorite, Nips, made a detour towards the acorn wood. We reached the spot, tied Lightfoot to a neighboring tree, and began rapidly to fill the sack. As we were thus engaged, Nips sprang suddenly into a bush close by, from which a moment afterwards issued such strange cries that Ernest followed to see what could be the matter. "Come," he shouted, "come and help me. I've got a couple of birds and their eggs. Quick, ruffed grouse!" We hurried to the spot. There was Ernest with a fluttering, screaming bird in either hand, while with his foot he was endeavoring to prevent his greedy little monkey from seizing the eggs. We quickly tied the legs of the birds, and removing the eggs from the nest, placed them in Ernest's hat, while he gathered some of the long, broad grass with which the nest was woven, and which grew luxuriantly around, for Franz to play at sword drill with. We then loaded the onager with the acorns and moved homewards. The eggs I covered carefully with dry moss, that they might be kept warm, and as soon as possible I handed them over to my wife, who managed the mother so cleverly that she induced her to return to the eggs, and in a few days, to our great delight, we had 15 beautiful little Canadian chicks. Franz was greatly pleased with the swords his brother brought him, but having no small companion on whom to exercise his valor, he amused himself for a short time in hewing down imaginary foes, and then cut the reeds in slips, and plaited them to form a whip for Lightfoot. The leaves seemed so pliable and strong that I examined them to see to what further use they might be put. Their tissue was composed of long, silky fibers. A sudden thought struck me. This must be New Zealand flax. I could not rest till I had announced this invaluable discovery to my wife. She was no less delighted than I was. "Bring me the leaves," she exclaimed. "Oh, what a delightful discovery! No one shall now be clothed in rags. Just make me a spindle, and you shall soon have shirts and stockings and trousers, all good homespun. Quick, Fritz, and bring your mother more leaves." We could not help smiling at her eager zeal, but Fritz and Ernest sprang on their steeds, and soon the onager and buffalo were galloping home again, each laden with a great bundle of flax. The boys dismounted and deposited their offering at their mother's feet. "Capital!" she exclaimed. "I shall now show you that I am not at all behindhand in ingenuity. This must be retted, carded, spun, and woven, and then with scissors, needle, and thread I will make you any article of clothing you choose." We decided that Flamingo Marsh would be the best spot for the operation of steeping, or retting, the flax. On next morning we set out thither, the cart drawn by the ass and laden with the bundles, between which sat Franz and Nips, while the rest of us followed with spades and hatchets. I described to my boys as we went along the process of retting, and explained to them how steeping the flax leaves destroys the useless membrane while the strong fibers remain. As we were employed in making beds for the flax and placing it in them, we observed several nests of the flamingo. These are most curiously and skillfully made of glutinous clay, so strong that they can neither be overturned nor washed away. They are formed in the shape of blunted cones, and placed point downwards. At the upper and broader end is built a little platform to contain the eggs, on which the female bird sits with her long legs in the water on either side, until the little birds are hatched and can take to the water. For a fortnight we left the flax to steep, and then taking it out and drying it thoroughly in the sun, stored it for future use at Falconhurst. Daily did we load our cart with provisions to be brought to our winter quarters. Manioc, potatoes, coconuts, sweet acorns, sugar canes were all collected and stored in abundance. For grumbling thunder, lowering skies, and sharp showers warned us that we had no time to lose. Our corn was sowed, our animals housed, our provisions stored, when down came the rain. To continue in our nest we found impossible, and we were obliged to retreat to the trunk, where we carried such of our domestic furniture as might have been injured by the damp. Our dwelling was indeed crowded. The animals and provisions below, and our beds and household goods around us, hemmed us in on every side. By degrees, by dint of patience and better packing, we obtained sufficient room to work and lie down in. By degrees, too, we became accustomed to the continual noise of the animals and the smell of the stables. The smoke from the fire, which we were occasionally obliged to light, was not agreeable, but in time even that seemed to become more bearable. To make more space, we turned such animals as we had captured, and who therefore might be imagined to know how to shift for themselves, outside during the daytime, bringing them under the arched roots only at night. To perform this duty, Fritz and I used to sally forth every evening, and as regularly every evening did we return soaked to the skin. To obviate this, my wife, who feared these continual wettings might injure our health, contrived waterproofs. She brushed on several layers of caoutchouc over stout shirts, to which she attached hoods. She then fixed to these duck trousers, and thus prepared for each of us a complete waterproof suit, clad in which we might brave the severest rain. In spite of our endeavors to keep ourselves busy, the time dragged heavily. Our mornings were occupied in tending the animals. The boys amused themselves with their pets, and assisted me in the manufacture of carding combs and a spindle for their mother. The combs I made with nails, which I placed head downwards on a sheet of tin about an inch wide. Holding the nails in their proper positions, I poured solder round their heads to fix them to the tin, which I then folded down on either side of them to keep them perfectly firm. In the evening, when our room was illuminated with wax candles, I wrote a journal of all the events which had occurred since our arrival in this foreign land, and while my wife was busy with her needle, and Ernest making sketches of birds, beasts, and flowers, with which he had met during the past months, Fritz and Jack taught little Franz to read. Week after week rolled by. Week after week saw us still close prisoners. Incessant rain battered down above us. Constant gloom hung over the desolate scene.
This book is continued on Disc 6.